3 bodies lay sprawled across the humid floor of the Dravoshi Cultural Exchange Biodome. None were dead, though the stillness of their limbs suggested a finality that made the air feel heavy. One man was slumped against a nutrient tank, his neck twisted at an impossible angle from a precision nerve strike to the cervical junction. Another was pinned beneath the heavy, dripping leaves of a monstera, his shoulder clearly dislocated and a purple bruise blooming where a chokehold had crushed the consciousness out of him. The third was the most jarring. He lay face down in a bed of moss, a shattered Tyrolean orchid pot resting beside his temple. Sable Arden didn't look like a killer. She stood in the center of the carnage, her soil-stained hands moving with a steady, practiced grace as she adjusted a displaced fern. She reached into her apron pocket, fingers brushing the handles of her pruning shears, but she only pulled out a small wire tie to secure a leaning stem. Her breathing was as rhythmic as a sleeping child's. In the doorway, Inspector Hulleth stood paralyzed, his physical logbook open to a fresh page. The ink on his pen had dried. For the first time in his career, he had no words to describe the woman he had spent 7 months ignoring. Why had he ever thought she was just a florist? I'll do my best to provide the clarity you're looking for regarding how a simple civilian could dismantle a professional hit team in under a dozen seconds. If you find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about the people in the background, consider subscribing to see who else is hiding in plain sight. Let's look closer at the file Hulleth had so carelessly approved. 8 months ago, the application had landed on Hulleth's desk with the weight of a feather. Sable Arden. Role: botanical maintenance. Skills: horticulture, soil chemistry, floral arrangement. Her security clearance was level 1, the absolute lowest for a station resident. She was wiry, olive-skinned, and possessed a gaze that was perhaps a little too steady for a merchant, but Hulleth had chalked that up to the solitary nature of her work. He had signed the digital pad without a second thought. Since then, Sable had become a fixture of the station's quietest corners. She grew earth roses next to bioluminescent Kalari moss, their scents clashing in a way that most found dizzying but the ambassador found divine. Every morning, she delivered a fresh arrangement to the diplomatic offices. She was the woman who brought Ambassador Kellis his chamomile tea, the woman who swept the petals from the walkway, and the woman the high-ranking Dravoshi walked past as if she were part of the architecture. Hulleth himself passed the biodome daily. He would nod, she would offer a polite, thin-lipped smile, and he would continue to his office to worry about real threats. But looking back at his handwritten logs, the patterns were there, buried like dormant seeds. Florist knows every species' pollen toxicity threshold, unusual for a civilian, he had written in month 3. A month later, she repotted the Vrethian spore lily with gloves rated for nerve agent handling. Standard garden gloves were available. He had even noted how she stood. Whenever visitors entered the greenhouse while the ambassador was there, Sable was always positioned between the door and the elderly diplomat. Every single time, he'd filed it under overprotective employee. The truth was far more clinical. The 3 unregistered men had entered the dome during the quiet lull of the afternoon shift. They were shadows in high-spec chameleon suits, weapons concealed, moving with the synchronized lethality of a strike team. Hulleth had only caught them because he was running a manual sensor sweep, but by the time his screen flashed red, the intervention had already begun. Sable hadn't hesitated. She hadn't even dropped her trowel. She had been standing near a shelf of heavy clay pots, her worn leather gardening gloves pulled tight over her knuckles. As the lead assassin reached for a silenced pulse pistol, Sable moved. It wasn't a scramble. It was a transition. She used the environment as if she'd designed it for a massacre. The clay pot went first, hurled with a velocity that caught the first man in the throat. Before he hit the ground, she was already inside the guard of the second, her hand snapping forward in a strike so precise it looked like she was merely pointing at his chest. The efficiency was surgical. No wasted motion. No screaming. Within 11 seconds, the threat was neutralized. The station's silent gardener stood over the wreckage of an elite assassination squad, and the only sound in the biodome was the gentle, rhythmic drip of the automated irrigation system. Hulleth retreated to his office, his scales shivering. He didn't check the station's main computer. He went deeper, bypassing the civilian shells and tapping into the Terran archival fragments that weren't supposed to exist on a civilian exchange station. He searched for the name Sable Arden and found nothing. He searched for the biometrics of the woman in the greenhouse and found a ghost. Hulith's fingers trembled as he scrolled through the data fragments. The file didn't just contain a history of violence. It was a catalog of biological precision. The woman in the greenhouse was an expert in plant alkaloids, naturally occurring organic compounds that plants use for defense. He realized now that humans had spent millennia mastering these toxins. From the digitalis of the foxglove used to regulate heartbeats or stop them entirely, to the curare used on primitive hunting arrows, Sable's species had turned the Earth's beauty into a pharmacy and an armory. Her service record noted she was a classified operative, specializing in contact toxicology. Every plant he had seen her touch suddenly felt like a cocked pistol. He returned to the biodome an hour later. The bodies were gone, whisked away by a silent cleanup crew Hulith hadn't authorized. Sable was exactly where he'd left her, though now she was sweeping up the terracotta shards of the shattered orchid pot. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharply sweet, the scent of bruised stems. "You knew they were coming," Hulith said, his voice echoing in the vast glass ribs of the dome. Sable didn't stop sweeping. "I knew the air changed. People carry scents, Inspector. Synthetic fibers, weapon oil, adrenaline. The plants notice before we do." Hulith looked at her gardening gloves, resting on the potting bench. Those worn, leather tools had just performed a lethal dance, yet they looked perfectly mundane, caked in the same soil she used to nourish the ambassador's tea. He thought of the Vrethian spore lily. In the right hands, its pollen could paralyze a Dravoshi in seconds. "The garden?" Hulith asked, his scales tightening. "All of it. The placement, the species, is any of it just flowers?" Sable finally looked up. Her dark eyes were unreadable, devoid of the civilian softness she had worn like a mask for 7 months. She leaned her broom against a pillar and wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Everything here grows, Inspector," she said softly. "That part is real." She turned back to her work, leaving him standing in the center of her beautiful, deadly fortress. Hulith realized then that he wasn't looking at a florist who happened to be a soldier. He was looking at a soldier who had decided that growing things was the only way to stay sane after 14 years of tearing them down. The terrifying part wasn't her file. It was the realization that for a human like Sable, the skill required to keep a delicate orchid alive was exactly the same precision required to snap a man's spine. By the next morning, the routine had restored itself. The biodome was a sanctuary of light and green. Sable's gardening gloves sat on the bench, one thumb worn almost through from years of hard labor. Beside them sat a fresh Tyrolean orchid, its petals of vibrant, mocking purple, replacing the one she had used to crush a skull. Ambassador Kellis walked in, his ionic cane tapping rhythmically on the tiles. He smiled at Sable, and she handed him a steaming cup of chamomile. The diplomat sipped the tea, closing his eyes in genuine appreciation of the peace she provided. He didn't know about the red ink in her file. He didn't know the garden was a weapons cache. He just knew the flowers were beautiful. Sable watched him drink, her hands resting lightly on the bench near her shears. The station hummed around them, oblivious to the predator in the petals.